Our speaker is Monsignor Paul McPartlan. He's a priest of the Archdiocese of Westminster in London and the Carl J. Peter Professor of Systematic Theology and Ecumenism at the Catholic University of America. He's presently serving as acting dean of the School of Theology and Religious Studies at CUA. He was born in Newcastle upon Tyne in Mother England and graduated from Cambridge in mathematics in 1978. Having studied philosophy and theology at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, he was ordained a priest by Cardinal Basil Hume in 1984. He gained his doctorate from Oxford and then served for 4 years in a London parish. After holding a postdoctoral research fellowship at St. Edmund's College, Cambridge, from 1993 to 1995, he was appointed to the faculty of Heathrow College in the University of London, where he taught systematic theology for 10 years before coming to CUA in 2005. Monsignor Paul has served for 2 terms on the International Theological Commission, 2004 to 2009, and 2009 to 2014. A member of the International Commission for Theological Dialogue between the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church since 2005. He's also participated in the International Anglican Roman Catholic and Roman Catholic Methodist dialogues. He's also a member of our North American Orthodox Catholic Theological Consultation and was appointed as a papal chamberlain by Pope Benedict XVI in 2008. And so, to speak on the topic, the Bishop of Rome, Fresh Catholic Thinking and Possible Ways Forward, please welcome Monsignor Paul McPartlan.
Thank you very much, Father Ron. It's a great pleasure to be taking part in this Orientale Lumen Conference focusing on the role and office of the Bishop of Rome. And I congratulate Jack Fiegel on again choosing a highly topical theme for the conference, and I thank him, of course, for kindly inviting me to speak. Everyone knows that this topic and the whole issue of universal primacy in the Church with which it is associated was the main reason for the Schism of 1054 and is the most difficult topic needing resolution today, if Catholics and Orthodox are really going to be reconciled. I suspect, however, that not many people are aware of the fresh thinking on this topic that has taken place within the Catholic Church and in Catholic theology in recent decades. It's that fresh thinking that I particularly wish to highlight in this talk. But I'd like to start by giving some context. And I hope perhaps you have the chart of dates that was just passed around. Please don't worry, I'm not going to go through it line by line as you may be fearing. Relax, that is not my intention. I'm simply going to pick out certain dates and certain events that are marked there on the sheet in what I hope is a useful way. It was the meeting of Paul VI and Ecumenical Patriarch Athenagoras on the Mount of Olives in 1964, which you can see as one of the events there, which opened up a whole new phase of relations between Orthodox and Catholics. The mutual anathemas of 1054 were lifted on the penultimate day of the Second Vatican Council, the 7th of December 1965, that's another date on your chart, and the dialogue of charity between the two churches got underway with joyful visits from Pope Paul VI to Constantinople and Patriarch Athenagoras to Rome in 1967, also there on the chart. Then in 1979, Pope John Paul II and Ecumenical Patriarch Demetrios announced the start of the formal theological dialogue, the dialogue of truth between Catholics and Orthodox. A plan for the dialogue was published in 1980, and a carefully organized sequence of agreed statements followed through the 1980s, and they're there on your chart. 1982, the Munich Statement on the mystery of the Church and the Eucharist in the light of the mystery of the Holy Trinity. 1987, the Bari Statement on faith, sacraments, and the unity of the Church. And 1988, the Valamo Statement on the Sacrament of Order in the Sacramental Structure of the Church, with particular reference to the importance of the apostolic succession for the sanctification and unity of the people of God, proving once again that this dialogue has never been known for its snappy titles. Why those topics? Well, Catholics and Orthodox want to celebrate the Eucharist together again. That will be the sign and the seal of our full communion. Building towards that goal, first we have to agree on what the Eucharist is. That was the point of the first statement. And then we have to agree on the various preconditions for Eucharist. First of all, faith and baptism. That was the second statement. And then, thinking historically or vertically, the ordination of ministers in apostolic succession through the ages. That was the third statement. And what remains then is to consider the bonds of communion that should unite local churches and their bishops today, horizontally, if you like. And that's where synodality and primacy fit in, the last piece of the jigsaw, we might say. And that was the topic for the document prepared for the 1990 plenary meeting of the dialogue at Freising in Germany. You see, it was all focused on the Eucharist, and I'd invite you this evening just to keep that focus in mind. As things turned out, after the fall of communism in 1989-1990 rather, and the subsequent re-emergence of the Eastern Catholic churches, which had often been suppressed under the communists, the thorny issue, what's often called Uniatism, raised its head once again, and Orthodox demanded that the plan of the dialogue be suspended so that Uniatism could be treated immediately. A document on Uniatism was agreed at Ballamand in 1993, but that really didn't resolve the matter. And after an acrimonious meeting here in Baltimore in 2000, it was feared that the dialogue might have just run into the sand. Happily, the formal theological dialogue between the two churches restarted in 2005 with new co-chairmen and many new members. That's when Metropolitan Kallistos and I and others were brought in. And the draft statement from 1990 that had been just sitting there on ice on synodality and primacy was taken up again. After some revisions, that became the very important Ravenna Statement, agreed in 2007, which in turn opened the way for direct discussion of the most difficult topic of all between Catholics and Orthodox, namely universal primacy, the papacy. Dialogue on that topic in the intervening years has been very laboured. However, the election of Pope Francis has had a galvanizing effect, not only on the Catholic Church and on the world at large, but also on Catholic-Orthodox dialogue. When Pope Francis first appeared on the balcony of St. Peter's after his election, he instantly sent some new signals about his ministry and his office. He referred to himself not as the new Supreme Pontiff, but as the new Bishop of Rome. And he used St. Ignatius of Antioch's famous phrase from the earliest patristic times, when he referred to Rome as the church which presides in charity, implicitly understanding the church as a communion, not a pyramid. 6 days later, for the first time ever, a patriarch of Constantinople attended the inauguration of a new bishop of Rome. On the following day, it was Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew who spoke on behalf of all the ecumenical and inter-religious delegates who had attended Pope Francis's inauguration. Before he gave his formal reply, Pope Francis turned to Patriarch Bartholomew on his right and simply said, and I quote, "I express my heartfelt thanks for what my brother Andrew has said to us." My brother Andrew. No, he hadn't forgotten the Patriarch's name. He was recalling the link of Andrew and Constantinople and expressing the fact that as Peter and Andrew were brothers, so were he and Bartholomew. As far as Catholic-Orthodox relations were concerned, he could really have finished his speech there. and he would already have warmed hearts immeasurably. Building on those auspicious beginnings, the two leaders met again last May in Jerusalem, and again in November when Pope Francis visited Constantinople for the Feast of St. Andrew. The warmth of both meetings was palpable. The International Dialogue held another plenary meeting in September of last year at Amman in Jordan, when we got close to agreeing a statement on primacy, but some of the Orthodox present weren't happy enough to accept it, and since consensus is the rule, we ended without an agreed statement. There will be a further drafting meeting in Rome just next week that I'll be going to, and then a meeting of the Joint Coordinating Committee for the International Dialogue in the fall. Let's pray for progress. Meanwhile, we might note that when Pope Francis's eagerly awaited encyclical letter on ecology, Laudato Si', is launched tomorrow, Metropolitan John Zizioulas of Pergamon, the Orthodox co-chair of the International Dialogue, will be one of the 4 speakers at the event in Rome. That itself is an eloquent indication of the growing closeness of our churches, and more specifically, I think, of Orthodox esteem for Pope Francis. We need to note also that a major event is upcoming in the Orthodox Church itself. In March of last year, there was a very significant meeting or synaxis of leaders of all 14 autocephalous Orthodox churches in Constantinople, at which it was decided to press ahead with plans for a council, a holy and great synod of bishops of the Orthodox Church in 2016, just next year, and that will surely be a major event with considerable ecumenical implications. In his address to the synaxis, Patriarch Bartholomew expressed his serious concern for the unity of all 14 Orthodox churches. Orthodoxy often appears, he said, to be many churches, I quote, divided and dissenting, instead of one church. In order to convince people, he said, that we have the word of life, the message of hope, and the experience of love, we have to be united. Well, Catholics instinctively think of the Pope as the key to church unity. But Patriarch Bartholomew seemed to distance himself from Catholic ideas when he said that the Orthodox had to, and I quote, avoid any deviation towards conceptions foreign to Orthodox ecclesiology concerning the exercise of universal authority by any local church or its primate, end of quote. The Orthodox Church has only one instrument, he said, for preserving its unity, and that is synodality. Broadly speaking, synodality means togetherness, living and deciding in common with everyone involved. It's about community, communion, collaboration in the church at large. More technically, it refers to collaboration and decision-making by the bishops who lead the church, especially in councils or synods. So the words conciliarity and collegiality are sometimes used as well. So there's primacy and there's synodality. Do they necessarily conflict? No, not at all. Metropolitan John Zizioulas has often said that synodality needs primacy in order to function. There needs to be leadership and coordination. And on the other hand, primacy needs synodality in order to benefit from the wisdom of others and to avoid being repressive. If Orthodox tend to specialize in synodality, it could well be said that Catholics specialize in primacy. And how? But neither of those specializations is healthy on its own. We need to learn from each other, and that's surely how we will eventually, please God, re-establish communion between us. While notably recognizing the need for a primacy at the universal level in the life of the Church, the Ravenna document also emphasized the balance between primacy and synodality that was needed for reconciliation. After identifying 3 levels, local, regional, and universal, in the life of the Church, it said, and I quote, that primacy at all levels is a practice firmly grounded in the canonical tradition of the Church, end of quote. But also it added that it must never be forgotten, and again I quote, that primacy and conciliarity are mutually interdependent. Now, Ravenna recognized, of course, that only one candidate is really seriously offered for universal primacy, and that is the See of Rome, which has always been first in the taxis or listing of major sees ever since the early centuries. It quoted those famous words of Ignatius of Antioch, that the local Church of Rome presides in love, and it asked for the role of the Bishop of Rome in the communion of all the churches to be studied in greater depth. What is the specific function of the Bishop of the First See in an ecclesiology of koinonia, it said? And how should the teaching of the First and Second Vatican Councils on the universal primacy be understood and lived in light of the ecclesial practice of the first millennium? Pardon me disappearing for a moment, just to grab this. Those are the very questions that I tried to respond to with a Eucharistic key in my recent little book on primacy, A Service of Love. And we'll turn to them in a moment, and there are some flyers on the front desk if you should like to have one. For now, let's just note with regard to the synodality that balances primacy, that Pope Francis has said quite plainly that the Catholic Church needs to learn from the Orthodox Church in this area. In his apostolic exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium, he said that in the dialogue with our Orthodox brothers and sisters, we Catholics have the opportunity to learn more about the meaning of episcopal collegiality and their experience of synodality. It's very clear that Pope Francis wants to have much more synodality in the Catholic Church. We're in between two major synods on the family at present, last October and this October. And Pope Francis has deliberately encouraged very free and open speech on the issues. This is all a little bit new. Catholics undoubtedly have much to learn from their Orthodox brothers and sisters about synodality. However, it might also be noted with regard to the Holy and Great Synod that's to be held in 2016, that there's been a desire to hold such an event for at least 50 years. Metropolitan Kallistos said last night there's been a desire for the last 112 years. Progress towards it has been very slow and problematic. In 1958, Pope St. John the 23rd was elected. Within 3 months, as Metropolitan Kallistos also mentioned yesterday, in January 1959, he had announced his intention to call an ecumenical council, and just over 3 years later, Vatican II convened and changed the face of the Catholic Church. That's the benefit of a strong primacy. So I would respectfully suggest that both sides, Catholics and Orthodox, have something to learn from the other with regard to the relationship between primacy and synodality, especially at the universal level of the Church's life. And so, what is that fresh thinking that's been going on in Catholic circles on this theme? I said that Pope Francis sent some new signals as soon as he appeared on the balcony after his election. But it would be mistaken to think that that's when the change began. The change, I would suggest, began with the Second Vatican Council, or rather, with the theological renewal that lay behind the Council, the so-called Nouvelle Théologie, with pioneers like Henri de Lubac and Yves Congar. And I would suggest that Pope Francis is best understood as leading the Church into a deeper reception of the teaching of the Council on key issues like the importance of mission, care for the poor, the sensus fidelium, and our own topic, the balance between primacy and collegiality, or synodality. Episcopal collegiality was one of the prime doctrines of Vatican II, complementing what the First Vatican Council, which, as Father Robert reminded us yesterday, was simply adjourned in 1870 and never properly completed, what the First Vatican Council had said about papal primacy. Lumen Gentium 22 solemnly states, and I quote, that together with the Supreme Pontiff and never apart from him, they, the College of Bishops, have supreme and universal authority over the Church. End of quote. Soon afterwards, the young Joseph Ratzinger emphasized that that doctrine about the solidarity between the bishops needed to be anchored in a clear understanding of the solidarity of all the baptized. In other words, the collegiality of the bishops is rooted in the communion of all the faithful. Ultimately, he said, and I quote, there is collegiality of the bishops when there is brotherliness of the church, and the collegiality of the bishops fulfills its meaning only if it serves that brotherliness. And the key for him to maintaining proper relations between the bishops and their people, and between the bishops themselves, was the Eucharist. It needed to be understood once again, he said, as the Council had taught, that becoming a bishop is to receive the fullness of the sacrament of order, that the bishop is therefore the prime celebrant of the Eucharist in the Church, and that the Eucharist is not just about making present the body and blood of Christ by transubstantiation. It is that, of course, but it's not just that. It's about building the Church. Because, as he said, the Eucharist is, by its very essence, sacramentum ecclesiae, the sacrament of the Church. He was manifestly applying de Lubac's famous principle, the Eucharist makes the Church. It's notable that the Council defined episcopal collegiality in Lumen Gentium 22, immediately after declaring in Lumen Gentium 21 that becoming a bishop was truly an ordination to what the Fathers called the high priesthood, the fullness of the sacrament of orders, with first responsibility for the celebration of the Eucharist. And it can't be a coincidence that that was in Lumen Gentium 21 and collegiality was in Lumen Gentium 22. The idea that the Church itself is a communion anchored in the Trinity is found in Lumen Gentium 4 and 9. And the idea that the Eucharist makes the Church is found throughout Lumen Gentium, in paragraphs 3, 7, 11, 26, for a start. So the renewal that the Council promoted clearly related the episcopacy and episcopal collegiality to the Eucharist and the communion life of the Church. But what about the Pope at the head of the College of Bishops? Can the papacy be related to the Eucharist also? Well, in 1953, in his major book, Méditation sur l'Église, translated as The Splendor of the Church, which clearly anticipated Lumen Gentium a decade later, de Lubac made a link not just between the collegiality of the bishops and the Eucharist, but also between the papacy at the head of the College of Bishops and the Eucharist. He said the following, remarkably linking local Christians with their bishops, and the bishops with one another and with the Pope, all through the Eucharist. I quote, each bishop constitutes the unity of his flock, the people adhering to its priest, cohering with the heavenly sacraments. But each bishop is himself at peace and in communion with his brother bishops, who offer the same and unique sacrifice in other places, and make mention of him in their prayer as he makes mention of all of them in his. He and they together form one episcopate only, and are all alike at peace and in communion with the Bishop of Rome, who is Peter's successor, and the visible bond of unity. And through them, all the faithful are united. End of quote. Since the Council, that linking that de Lubac was already hinting at there, of the papacy itself to the Eucharist, has steadily gained ground in Catholic theology and doctrine. Writing in 1971, de Lubac noted an observation of the Reformed theologian Jean-Jacques von Almen, that in Luke's Gospel, Jesus' commissioning of Peter to strengthen his brethren, you remember, strengthen your brethren, occurred at the Last Supper, within the framework of the Eucharist, as he said. In other words, within the framework, and again I'm quoting, within the framework of what Jesus wishes to see endure until his return. The implication being that maybe the ministry that was given to Peter in that Eucharistic setting was itself meant to endure in the church, precisely as a service to the communion of the church that derives from the Eucharist. The Catechism of the Catholic Church, produced in 1992, after 6 years of drafting overseen by then Cardinal Ratzinger, situated the papacy likewise in a Eucharistically understood church. The church, it said, is the people that God gathers in the whole world. She exists in local communities and is made real as a liturgical, above all, a Eucharistic assembly. Section 752. And it added later on that, and I quote, the whole church is united with the offering and intercession of Christ. Since he has the ministry of Peter in the church, the Pope is associated with every celebration of the Eucharist, wherein he is named as the sign and servant of the unity of the universal church. End of quote. Section 1369. This is indeed a remarkable development within Catholic theology and doctrine. And if the Eucharist has been at the centre of Catholic Orthodox dialogue, as it has, and if the dialogue itself has adopted a Eucharistic ecclesiology, as it has, then this newly crafted idea that the papacy is actually a service rendered to the Eucharist, rather than just an office of universal juridical governance, would seem to offer promising prospects for progress, where previously there was just an impasse. The Catholic theologian and ecumenist Jean-Marie Tillard nicely summarized the new vision, and I quote, "The church is made by Eucharist and baptism," he said, "not by the papacy. The purpose of the papacy is to give the Eucharist its full dimensions." End of quote. 3 further points should be quickly noted. First of all, Vatican I, with its doctrines of papal primacy and infallibility, is often regarded as a no-go area when it comes to Catholic Orthodox dialogue on the papacy, as if that council must somehow be forgotten if we are to make progress. Well, Catholic theology can't just forget an ecumenical council, so we have to reckon with Vatican I fair and square. And a lot of work has actually been done in recent times to restore some of the nuance to its teaching. The nuance that was there at the start, but which has rather been lost in the public perception of the council. We might return to this later. But for now, let's just note a passage from Vatican I, rarely if ever quoted, that hints already, I think, at some of the connections I've just been making. The Council taught that primacy exists, and I quote, so that the episcopate itself might be one and undivided, and that the whole multitude of believers might be preserved in unity of faith and communion by means of a closely united priesthood. End of quote. So the life of the church was already recognized there as being one of communion. The importance of the episcopate itself being one and undivided was stressed in that context, as was the need for a united priesthood, implicitly referencing, it would seem, the Eucharist. And the papacy was seen as a service of unity to the episcopate, the priesthood, and ultimately the church at large. That's not normally how we hear Vatican I reported. Secondly, at the start of the second millennium, when the church began to be seen in the West as a pyramid with the Pope at the top, having the fullness of juridical power, It came to be thought that the bishops received their own jurisdiction by delegation from the Pope, that he gave each of them a portion of his own universal solicitude, and therefore that each bishop had received his authority through the Pope, or in Latin, per petrum, through Peter. That meant that Rome was no longer just a sister of the other churches, it was mother, mater et magistra. Vatican II's decree on ecumenism states in paragraph 2, and I quote, and this is a very carefully phrased statement, that Christ entrusted to the College of the 12 the task of teaching, ruling, and sanctifying, and that from among them he chose Peter. End of quote. That, I would suggest, as I just said, is a subtle formulation, implying that the three offices of teaching, ruling, and sanctifying were given to the 12 directly by Christ, and not through Peter. Peter was then chosen from among them. In the debate about that document, the decree on ecumenism, one of the bishops submitted a request that it be stated clearly that the power of ruling was given to Peter alone and through Peter per petrum to all the apostles. And the formal response that was made to that request stated firmly that proposal simply did not agree with the doctrine of Lumen Gentium. I would presume with Lumen Gentium 21. Which states that the priesthood and indeed all three offices of Christ are given to bishops at their episcopal ordination. In other words, while the office of ruling should be exercised in communion with the head and members of the college, as Lumen Gentium said, the office itself was not given by the Pope. That rejection of what we may well call the perpetual view at Vatican II, I think, is of the utmost significance, both historically and theologically. With the rejection of that idea goes the pyramid too, and back comes communion. Thirdly, Joseph Ratzinger's famous address at Grants in 1976 offered another contribution of great importance, both historically and theologically, to this whole question. He recalled Pope Paul VI's visit to Constantinople in 1967, and in particular he recalled how Patriarch Athenagoras had referred to him with three short phrases: successor of Peter, the first in honour among us, and the one who presides in charity. And Ratzinger acknowledged that archaic confession, as he called it, has nothing to do with the primacy of jurisdiction, but simply acknowledges a primacy of honour and agape. Nevertheless, he suggested, should we not regard it as sufficient? Rome need not ask for more, he said. Truly momentous words. And so to close, I'd like to suggest, again with reference to Vatican II, three particular ways in which the universal primacy might be exercised in a reconciled church, East and West. All of which these three ways relate in some way or other to the Eucharist. Namely, moderating disputes, presiding at ecumenical councils, and serving Eucharistic communion. And these are three ways that I specify in more detail in my book. First of all, then, moderating disputes. Vatican II said, and I quote, for many centuries the churches of the East and of the West went their own ways, though a brotherly communion of faith and sacramental life bound them together. If disagreements in faith and discipline arose among them, the Roman See acted by common consent as moderator. End of quote. Unitatis Fidelis Ratio 14. The Church needs a final court of arbitration to restore peace and Eucharistic fellowship when those have been broken. And there's lots of evidence that Rome was recognized in the first millennium as a place to which one could ultimately turn. In the chaotic aftermath of the Council of Nicaea, which refuted Arianism, much of the East remained Arian. And Orthodox bishops, like St. Athanasius, were deposed from their sees and suffered greatly. In the context of that ongoing crisis, in 343, a major council was in fact held at Sardica, which crafted rules for cases where a bishop had a grievance that couldn't be resolved locally. He could appeal to the Bishop of Rome, who wouldn't judge the matter himself, but could decide if there needed to be a retrial, and could send delegates to sit with the local bishops and reach a judgment with them. The rather nuanced rules were accepted not only in the West, but also later in the East too. And they might, I think, be very helpful in ecumenical discussions today. Secondly, presiding ecumenical councils. Lumen Gentium, again, teaches that there never is an ecumenical council which is not confirmed, or at least recognized as such, by Peter's successor. And it is the prerogative of the Roman Pontiff to convoke such councils, to preside over them, and to confirm them. Lumen Gentium 22. Well, the convoking of an ecumenical council by the Pope is something that didn't actually happen until the 12th century, significantly after the split between Christian West and East. Prior to that time, councils were normally convoked by the Emperor, often, however, with the encouragement of the Pope. Their purpose, of course, was to clarify the Church's faith, agreement in faith being a precondition for Eucharistic fellowship. Though popes never personally attended ecumenical councils in the first millennium, they normally sent delegates, and their involvement in some capacity was always regarded as a necessary condition for a council to be classed as ecumenical. The bond between popes and councils is very clear in the first millennium. After the reading of Pope Leo's tome on Christology at the Council of Chalcedon, the bishops cried, "Peter has spoken through Leo." Peter has spoken through Agatha, they cried, 230 years later, at the Third Council of Constantinople, when Pope Agatha's profession of faith condemning monothelitism was read out. And 100 years later, Pope Hadrian I's letter to the Empress Irene in favour of the veneration of icons was endorsed by the Second Council of Nicaea, held amid the grave crisis of iconoclasm. That council, in 787, the last of the councils recognised as ecumenical by both Catholics and Orthodox, actually gave a list of criteria for a properly ecumenical council, among which it clearly stated that the Pope of the Romans, as it said, had to be a cooperator or fellow worker, synergos, with the council, at least by letter or representatives. I think that there would be broad ecumenical agreement today that the Bishop of Rome, in consultation, of course, with his brother bishops, should convoke and preside at ecumenical councils. And so, finally, serving Eucharistic communion, the third primatial service that I'm suggesting. The previous two services, moderating disputes and presiding at ecumenical councils, though vital, are of course occasional and exercised only as needed. So this makes us think, is there an abiding ministry exercised by a universal primate, such that office might be understood indeed as willed and established by the Lord himself, as a constitutive part of his church? Well, recalling the early church, Vatican II referred to, and I quote, the very ancient discipline whereby the bishops installed throughout the whole world lived in communion with one another and with the Roman Pontiff in a bond of unity, charity, and peace. End of quote. That communion was celebrated and strengthened, of course, in every Eucharist, where the Bishop of Rome and other heads of churches were named and prayed for. And visitors from other local churches were welcomed. In essence, I would suggest that the universal primate symbolizes and serves the Eucharistic communion of the Church as a whole. The universal fellowship enjoyed by Christians thanks to the one Eucharist that is celebrated in countless places across the world. In particular, he symbolizes and serves the collegial unity of the bishops themselves, he and they being successors of the apostles who sat with the Lord at the Last Supper. The understanding of the Church as a communion of local churches was characteristic of the first millennium, before the West became highly juridical and the pyramid emerged at the start of the second millennium. As it did, major Eastern figures complained of that shift that I mentioned a moment ago, whereby instead of being an elder sister, as they were quite willing to recognize, Rome was now claiming to be mother of all the churches, source and origin of the others, with a universal jurisdiction. And so the bridge between East and West was hardened. The communion model of the Church has made a big comeback in recent times. The pyramid is much less evident, and the idea of Rome as mother of all the churches has vanished. In 2001, Cardinal Ratzinger, yes, that remarkable man once again, said this: "The Church of Rome is the mother church of the churches in Italy. But not, of course, the modern church of all the others. Jerusalem, Antioch, and Constantinople are mother churches too. Yet this motherhood, he said, can only be an image of the real mother church, the Jerusalem above, that Paul talks about, and of which the Father speaks so movingly." End of quote. The perspective of the Fathers is being reasserted there. And a major cause of friction between West and East is being quietly removed. Vatican II very significantly said that in any future reconciliation between Catholics and Orthodox, the right of the Eastern churches to govern themselves has to be recognized. And I quote, "while remembering the necessary unity of the whole church." End of quote. Unitatis Redemptoratio 16. In other words, some ministry has to express and serve that unity, the necessary unity of the whole church. And that's where I suggest the universal primate comes in. And it was those careful words from Vatican II that Pope Francis repeated almost verbatim last November in Constantinople. Ultimately, it's surely the Eucharist that must guide us towards a solution on universal primacy. What is essential is that the unity that the whole Church has through the celebration of one and the same Eucharist in all of the particular churches, both East and West, must be made visible. That's what we need. For the world to see it's one Eucharist, one mystery, one Saviour, gathering one people into one salvation. Charity, agape, was actually a patristic term for the Eucharist. And that led Cardinal Ratzinger to suggest that presiding in charity, to recall St. Ignatius' term one last time, actually means quite simply caring for the Church's Eucharistic unity. When he himself became Pope, he explained that idea more fully. And I'd like to close with his rather moving words. Quote, "The Petrine ministry is therefore the primacy of love in the Eucharistic sense. That is to say, solicitude for the universal communion of the Church in Christ. And the Eucharist is the shape and the measure of that communion. Thank you.